Hey, what's up you guys? I'm Sara Lubratt, and today we're going to be talking about how to write a satisfying ending for your book. This is episode 4 of a 5-part series. If you have not yet seen the first 3 episodes, I highly recommend going and watching those. We talk about planning, brainstorming, and outlining in episode 1. We talk about how to start writing a book in episode 2. We talk about writer's block and getting through the middle of your story in episode 3. And today we're going to be talking about how to write a satisfying ending. If you go on to enjoy this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a big thumbs up because that really supports my channel by telling the YouTube algorithm that you liked my video and that somebody else might too. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss episode 5 coming out next week. And now without further ado, let's get into the video. There are 4 main elements for writing a satisfying ending to your book. And that is a resolution for the central conflict in your book, some kind of transformation for your main character's development, at least your main characters, if not your side characters a little bit too, and how the story resolves should also show off your character's transformation. Some suspense at the ending always heightens the stakes a little bit, especially if you don't know if the character is going to get what they want, or if there's a chance that the main character might not succeed, and some last-minute tension makes the ending more satisfying when the main character overcomes their obstacles. And then the 4th element for a satisfying ending is some kind of surprise. This could be a bit of a plot twist, or something the reader is not necessarily expecting. If you have a totally predictable ending to your story, a reader might feel like the ending falls a bit flat, and I believe it was in Harlan Coben's BBC Maestro course, where he says try to have a plot twist on the very last page, because you want to stretch out the reader's interest until the very last page. Because if things feel resolved and there's 50 more pages left in the book, a reader might stop reading. You don't want your story to end in a predictable way where your readers saw it coming from the very first page, because then you will have readers that get bored and drop off, but you also don't want to have an ending that none of your readers could possibly ever see coming. So leaving in little tidbits of foreshadowing throughout the story, especially, is one of the best ways to lead up to a satisfying ending, because one of my favorite things as a reader is to read a book, be surprised by the ending, but not in a way that's like shocking, but just like really happy with how the author ended up resolving their story, and then going back through for a reread and picking up on all the little foreshadowing tidbits that lead up to the ending. And then when you have foreshadowing within your book, it will help encourage readers to reread your story because they want to find all of those little foreshadowing pieces and Easter eggs as they read. The second time, the third time, the 4th time, etc. In episodes 2 and 3 of this series, we talked about a principle that Brandon Sanderson talks about in his free lecture series that you can find here on YouTube. And he calls this the 3 Ps: promise, progress, and payoff. And while you're doing a little bit of these 3 things throughout the story, the ending is when you get to officially tie things together for the biggest payoff throughout the story, with the main plot and the main conflicts, as well as with subplots and smaller conflicts, or possibly internal conflicts for the characters, or personality clashing between the characters. You will have different threads kind of braiding together of the promise, progress, and payoff throughout your story, but essentially you want them all to be leading up to the climax of the story. The climax is often the biggest emotional point in your story. It's also the part of the book in which the main tensions are brought to the most intense point. And so when you have all of these strands being braided together of the promise, progress, and payoff, especially little payoffs leading up to the biggest payoff, which is the climax, and that biggest climax point often resolving a lot of the promise and progress that's been made throughout the story, is how you start to build your satisfying ending. Some other notes on how to write a satisfying ending is to tie up loose ends. You should be resolving any subplots or character arcs. Every question that's brought up throughout the book should have an answer by the end, even if it's saying that the character is going to be figuring it out after the story ends. The ending must be inevitable, satisfying, and logical, which sometimes you have to get to by trying out different endings for your story, which is something you could do as early as outlining your book, is figuring out a couple different ways the story could end. Maybe there's a big battle, maybe there's a breakup, maybe there's a twist or a surprise ending, but you don't want to make the ending clear until it's time. Basically until you just have a couple pages left. I personally find it really helpful to have an end point for what I'm setting out to do, which is write a book. With writing a satisfying ending, you also want to make sure that there is emotional closure and that your characters have solved their internal conflicts or have at least made serious progress on their internal conflicts. Your ending has to make sense with the rest of the story. Endings don't have to be happy to be satisfying, but they do need to have that emotional closure and they need to make sense for the story. The payoff also needs to fulfill all of the promises that you made early on in the story, including your character's motivation. And the beat sheet of Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which is a book that we have talked about throughout this series, mentions in the beat sheet how you should end the story, the finale and closing on the final image. Something that leaves your reader feeling satisfied, and you can even choose to mirror your opening image, which is how you begin your book, like the very first page, but you get to that final image by building and easing tension throughout the book, and then adding more and more tension as emotions and stakes are rising towards the conflict. You can throw in a plot twist that makes sense for the story, that stacks even more odds against your main character. And even though I said earlier that all of the questions brought up throughout the story should be answered, I think all of the questions brought up throughout the story should feel resolved. It shouldn't feel like there's any plot holes or anything that wasn't fully answered throughout the story. But it is okay to leave some open-endedness, to either leave room for interpretation or even leave space for a little bit of a cliffhanger. Especially if there are going to be more books in the series, it's always nice to leave the reader wanting a little bit more, whether that's the next book in the series or the next book you write. Whether you choose to have a happy ending or a sad ending for your story, evoking some kind of emotion is what helps the story stick with your readers. And that can mean the difference between a good story and a bestseller. So in summary, make sure that the ending resolves the storyline. All the main plot points, the character arcs, ensure you haven't left any plot holes, which can be fixed later on in editing, but try to make sure that there are a few plot holes as possible when you are wrapping up the ending. Try to wrap up all of the extra little details that linger in the reader's mind. Try to save a little bit of a twist for the very last page, and make sure that your main character's story arc is engaging until the very last page. You can go back to those likability scales that we talked about: likability, proactivity, and competence. And throughout the story, your characters will move around on those sliding scales to also help bring them to the very end. And when you finally give that emotional closure to the novel, your reader can close the book and be satisfied with the ending. And hopefully something about the story will stick with them for weeks, months, or years to come. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode on how to write a satisfying ending. Next week in episode 5, we're going to be talking about editing, revising, and knowing when you're done. That's all from me today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm Sara Lubratt. Make sure you like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.